It's interesting when we evaluate all the Gospels together, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that over 1/3 of them cover just this one week, from Palm Sunday to Christmas. To Easter. And going backwards. Uh, and it's interesting that it tells you how important that story was from Palm Sunday to Easter. That was the most important message they wanted to give us in all four Gospels, even though they go at it a little different way. Each one of them paints a different picture. It's still taken us to that scene at the cross and then on beyond that to resurrection. We often refer to this week as Passion Week, and indeed it is. Jesus will leave us great teaching from this week. Boy, there's so much in this week that we can learn. He will demonstrate, of course, the love of God in a way and to a degree unfathomable to those around him and even to his disciples. He will also confront man's blindness to the ways of God head on. Now, that same week is also a very important week in the religious life of the nation of Israel, because it was Passover week. During this week, the Jews celebrated their deliverance from slavery in Egypt. The Jewish law required that every Jewish male within 20 miles of Jerusalem attend the Passover. But Jews also came from all over the Roman Empire. The city was packed with pilgrims, and some scholars believe that during this week in which Jesus came into town, came in on the donkey, there were up to 2 million people in that area. It was a huge crowd there from all over the Roman Empire. Thousands of lambs would have been sacrificed, and the people would be praying for the coming of Messiah. All of that was going on at this time. Now, it's into that dramatic moment that Jesus comes and forces to the surface people's blindness to the ways of God. Blindness is a common theme throughout Scripture. From the time that Eve was blinded by Satan in the Garden of Eden to the ways of God, mankind's blindness has resulted in unspeakable tragedy and evil. We will fail to see temptation for what it is, and we will fail to see the drama of redemption as well. We will miss it. The Apostle Paul had to go through a bout of blindness, if you'll remember, on the road to Damascus, so that when the scales fell from his eyes, he would never see things the same way again. I want us to examine a couple of stories as Jesus was with his disciples on the way to Jerusalem, just the day before he gets there. There's some significant things happening. He's trying to prepare them for what they're about to face, but he has a lot of difficulty with it because of their blindness. One story is about seeing through serving. Another story is about seeing through trusting. And it's here that we see the map to the journey beyond the cross. And that map is we must see through the eyes of Jesus. Both of these stories illustrate that the journey beyond the cross will require less of me and more of God. So let me get the background passage in Mark 10, 32 to 34. Back on the road, they set out for Jerusalem. Jesus had a head start on them, and they were following, puzzled and not just a little afraid. He took the 12 and began to go over what to expect next. Listen to me carefully. We're on our way up to Jerusalem. When we get there, the Son of Man will be betrayed to the religious leaders and scholars. They will sentence him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Romans, who will mock and spit on him, give him the third degree, and kill him. After 3 days, he will arise alive. Wow. The disciples didn't really quite know how to handle that. That's what he was telling them just the day before they arrived. Here he attempts to remove their blindness to the ways of God, and what he's saying to them really absolutely makes no sense to them. Not because they didn't hear it, but because it didn't fit their agenda for the Messiah. They may have said to each other, to some degree, well, there he goes again, talking in parables. Maybe when we get to Jerusalem, we'll figure out what he's talking about. Meanwhile, we need to get on with what we have already decided that God is going to do. How often we do that. We already decide what God is going to do, and we don't hear him. It's part of our blindness. And this interpretation is certainly borne out by what follows in Mark 10, 35 to 45. James and John. Now, this is right after he said just what he said about dying on the cross. James and John, Zebedee's sons, came up to him. Teacher, we have something we want you to do for us. What is it? I'll see what I can do. Arrange it, they said, so that we will be awarded the highest places of honor in your glory, one of us at your right, the other at your left. Jesus said, you have no idea what you're asking. Are you capable of drinking the cup that I drink, of being baptized with the baptism I'm about to be plunged into? Sure, they said. Why not, Jesus said. Come to think of it, you will drink the cup I drink and be baptized in my baptism, but as to awarding places of honor, that's not my business. There are other arrangements for that. Well, when the other 10 heard of this conversation, they lost their temper with James and John. Now, you can see what's going on here. You know, who's first in line? Who's going to be the greatest? It's a little power struggle going on. Jesus got them together to settle things down. You've observed how godless rulers throw their weight around, he said. And when people get a little power, how quickly it goes to their heads. It's not going to be that way with you. Whoever wants to be great must become a servant. Whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. That is what the Son of Man has done. He came to serve and not to be served, and then to give away his life in exchange for many who are held hostage. Wow. It's hard to know exactly where the disciples were after he said that. That had to be a difficult thing for them too. The blindness of the disciples is poignantly illustrated here. The disciples are still seeking a kingdom of power, and Jesus came to reveal that God's kingdom is a kingdom of love. And servanthood is always a mark of love. Servanthood will always follow love. We struggle so much with the depth of the love of God for us, so visibly illustrated in the life and death of Jesus. That's what Jesus was trying to communicate to his disciples on the way to Jerusalem, where he would die. It's a way of love and not the way of power. Sometimes we simplify too much this idea of service. There's a lot of ways to serve folks. There's a lot of ways to step into someone's life and help them, and we can name many ways. But sometimes the way we need to step into someone's life to help them, to serve them, is just to listen and be there for them. I was at a conference a few years ago at Denver Seminary, and I was at a table, and I was sitting next to a man from Africa. He was from Western Africa, and we got to talking. And I was curious. I asked him, I said, in where you live, in the village where you lived, do American churches send short-term missionaries over there, short-term people come over for a week or two to do projects in the area where you're at? And he said, yeah, they do that. So tell me what you think of that. I'd like to have your opinion of that. How do you see that as a villager there in that African country? And he said, we appreciate all those who come over, and we appreciate what they do for us. But he said, there's one thing they don't do that we would like. I said, what is that? We would like for it to take a little time out of doing stuff and sit down with us and just share life with us. Just share life with us. Talk to us. Help us understand who you are, and you understand who we are, and we just come together in fellowship. That was an interesting observation from this young man from Africa, and how true that is. Sometimes we forget the most important part, and that is to touch each other's lives where we are, to share with each other wherever we are. So those who were coming over were serving, and they were missing the best part. And that's what I was enjoying right there, is just sitting there sharing with him and him sharing with me. It was a rich moment. We miss that sometimes. And how many times could we save lives and help people if we're just willing to do that? How many wars could be avoided? How many children could be saved from a life of crime if our relationships were based on serving out of a heart of love rather than controlling through power? We just can't do it if we don't see through the eyes of Jesus. Are we viewing our relationships this morning through the eyes of Jesus? That's the only way the blindness of promoting myself will be healed, is I have to see it through his eyes. And that's what he was trying to teach his disciples. We must first see through the eyes of Jesus by serving one another. But there's another seeing, and that's a seeing of trusting. They're going through Jericho now. The next place will be Jerusalem. And in Mark 10:46-52, we have this story. They spent some time in Jericho. As Jesus was leaving town, trailed by his disciples and a parade of people, a blind beggar by the name of Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, was sitting alongside the road. When he heard that Jesus the Nazarene was passing by, he began to cry out, "Son of David, Jesus, mercy, have mercy on me." Many tried to hush him up, but he yelled all the louder, "Son of David, mercy, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped in his tracks. "Call him over." They called him. "It's your lucky day. Get up. He's calling you to come." Throwing off his coat, he was on his feet at once and came to Jesus. Jesus said, "What can I do for you?" The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." "On your way," said Jesus. "Your faith has saved you and healed you." And in that very instant, he recovered his sight and followed Jesus down the road. So Jesus sets off down the road to an appointment with God, to a pivotal climax in history. There's a crowd following him that is fearful, apprehensive, confused, and excited. All of that going on at once. Some may have been saying, maybe we'll finally find out what this is all about. There's still a lot of blindness in that crowd. Into that dramatic moment, Jesus' trip is interrupted by a blind beggar. How much of Jesus' life recorded for us in the Scripture is a result of being interrupted? You realize how many stories we would not have in the Gospels if he had not allowed himself to be interrupted? There's a key point of all of these stories. The woman at the well, the Gadarene demoniac, the woman caught in adultery, the woman pouring perfume on his feet, a tax collector in a tree, a thief hanging on the cross. All interruptions that Jesus touched and met. You see, someone whose eyes has been opened to the love of God being demonstrated to another through serving them would never be bothered by an interruption. Jesus wasn't bothered by interruptions. Though others tried to hush this blind beggar up, "Just be quiet, we don't have time for you," and to get him to stay off to the side, Jesus hears him and he stops. One of the amazing things about God is that he does stop for those who seek in him. Even the power and force of God's creation can be brought to a stop when God intervenes in the life of one seeking him. The waves of the Red Sea stopped when God's people needed to cross. The waters of the Jordan River stopped when God's people needed to get to the Promised Land. And here on this fateful day, this faithful Sunday, when God was marching forth to the pivotal point of all of time, to the grand plan of redemption to all of mankind, he stops for a poor, blind beggar on the side of the road. Jesus stands before this beggar, an outcast of society who just wants to talk to him. And Jesus asks him, "What do you want me to do for you?" Interesting that he would ask that question. The disciples, James and John, had just asked Jesus to do something for them that would violate God's ways, because that was a question coming from their blindness. Jesus now gives a blind man, Bartimaeus, a chance to answer in a way that would demonstrate God's ways. Now, we have to be careful here. It would seem obvious to us what Bartimaeus would want Jesus to do. Hey, he's blind. He would like to see. But from Bartimaeus' perspective, the answer is not probably as apparent as we might think. Because of past hurts, fears, and even anger, asking to be able to see again wasn't necessarily so easy. Maybe he should just ask for a new cane. This one's old and worn out. A new cane would be a big help. Or how about a new chair? Sitting on the ground is so hard. Or a new cup for the few coins that people toss my way. Sure, that would make my life more comfortable, and I'll just get along. Now, before we laugh too much at such requests, think about ourselves. If Jesus came up to you this morning and to me this morning and asked us, "What can I do for you?" how would you respond? How would you respond? What can I do for you? Would you ask for a better job, a new house, some improvements in your spouse, better looking, help with a bad habit, help with cleaning up your life? How would we respond if we were asked that? Would we just want our life being made more comfortable, allowing us to get by better than we are? Or would we ask for sight into the ways of God? It's a big question. Because when you ask for sight into the ways of God, you don't know what the answer will be. You don't know. And if you don't know what the answer will be, guess what? You're out of control. You don't have control anymore. God does. And you could be made even uncomfortable. And God forbid if any of us in America ever get made uncomfortable. Boy, we struggle with that, don't we? We do want to be comfortable. But when we follow God, we will not always be comfortable. Bartimaeus had no idea what would happen if he asked Jesus to heal him. He had no idea of the future. He would be stepping out into an adventure, and an adventure is not an adventure if you know what's going to happen. It's not an adventure. But Bartimaeus was ready for God's adventure for his life. He wanted to see through the eyes of Jesus, and he said that, I want to see. Jesus healed him instantly. And life for Bartimaeus would never be the same. And did you notice in that scripture what he did next? Did you notice what he did next? He followed Jesus down the road. He followed Jesus down the road. He may have grew up, spent his whole life in Jericho. And here he's following Jesus down the road. What else would he do? He's been opened. He's had his eyes open to the ways of God. The ways of God is a way of trust. And he's just going to trust him wherever he leads. And off he goes toward Jerusalem with Jesus and the disciples. Many times, we're held back from trusting God because of fear of losing control. So we settle for so much less and we just get by. The deep desire of our heart, put there by God, is buried under our fear, and we try to lead that comfortable life that has no passion and no adventure. We remain blind to the ways of God because we will not trust him. And we need to be able to trust him daily. Through all of the struggles and events of life, we need to trust God for each step and be open to him leading us in a way that may be a surprise to us, that may not be what we expected, to enter into the life of another one that we may not even know, but yet needs us at that moment. I'll never forget, a few years ago, I was a chaplain on board a cruise ship, and I was sitting down to dinner, and I guess maybe someone had asked me about what I was doing as chaplain, but I had a young man who was serving us from Indonesia, and he apparently heard something, because about the end of the meal, he came back to me, and he bent down and said, I'm an Indonesian Christian. And I said, we actually have service together at midnight. Could you come? And I said, sure, I'll be there. He told me where to meet him. And I went with him, and we did a communion service that night. But the most important thing was this young man had a burden on his heart that no one knew about, and he was hurting. And he came to me to talk to me after that service that night. He said they served for 11 months on those cruise ships, 11 months, about 18 hours a day. I mean, and then they go home for a month and they start over. It is a grueling life for those guys, but they make good money compared to what they can make at home. And most of the time they send their money back home to support their family. Well, he had just heard from home that he'd been away for several months, that his wife had left him. She got a divorce without even being there and married another guy. And that's what he had just heard. Here he was, serving dinner to us Americans, smiling, being very kind, doing all he was supposed to do, while his heart was broken. And he needed someone to talk to. He needed someone to pray with him. And that's what he was asking that night. So you never know what's going on in the life around you until you respond to that need. I've always wondered, among the few people who were at the foot of the cross when Jesus died, if we would have found Bartimaeus. He would have been a quiet guy there at the foot of the cross. We might not have seen him. Nobody would have paid any attention to him. But that would not surprise me. That would have simply been another step of trust in this new adventure of seeing that God had launched him on. Why, he had waited through many dark nights with no hope in his blindness. Now, even when his hope was nailed to a cross, he could trust that hope for a few nights. Who knows what God might do? And Easter was his answer. He was trusting. On this Palm Sunday, leading us through this Passion Week, are you on your way beyond the cross to Easter, to resurrection life in Jesus? Are you trusting God to lead you from the darkness to the light of seeing through the eyes of Jesus? Are you renouncing your throne of power and control for a footstool of serving out of love for others and from the love that God has expressed to you? What would happen to us this week if we saw everything and everyone through the eyes of Jesus?
How can I